All right, so we are picking up in chapter 2. We didn't quite finish chapter 2. We ran out of time. And so we're going to be picking up at verse 15 in chapter 2. But just by way of reminder of what we had looked at, remember he's asked God, what are you going to do about the wickedness of Judah? It's very wicked. The law is useless to our people right now. Those who are to uphold justice are not upholding justice. Bad things are happening everywhere, Lord. You need to act. And so then God told him what he was going to do. And God said, I'm going to bring the Chaldeans or the Babylonians in, and I will judge my people with them. I'm going to destroy them. That's not the answer that Habakkuk was looking for. And so then Habakkuk reminded God of his character, not Habakkuk's character, but God's character. And I don't get how you, a holy God, could use such a wicked people on your own people. And so he at one point suggested, well, maybe you need to be using us to judge them. You need to judge them instead, right? And well, use God's people to do that. But he couldn't understand it. But at the end of all of it, he said, I'm going to go and stand here on the rampart, and I'm going to wait and be corrected, because obviously I'm not getting something. And so in chapter 2, God continues on. And one of the things that Habakkuk that had said in his response was that the Babylonians were worse than the people of Judah, which was not true. It's the opposite, unfortunately. And so that's why it would be just for God to use Babylon against his own people, because of how wicked his own people had got. But we get into chapter 2 then, and now we've got God revealing to Habakkuk, well, all right, yes, I'm going to judge my own people using Babylon, but then Babylon's going to be judged too because of her wickedness. And so we've got texts like 2 and verse 4, behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. That's going to come back again when we get to chapter 3, towards the end of chapter 3. Have faith, Habakkuk. God knows what he's doing. He distinguished the proud and the just, and we've talked about how the unfaithful Jews were certainly proud, and the Babylonians were proud, and there were some faithful Jews, very few, but there were some, and then it extends to all who trust in God. And we did note that this verse is brought forward into the New Testament on 3 separate occasions, in Romans, Galatians, and in the book of Hebrews. And so there was a proverb spoken concerning Babylon, talked about the battles that Babylon was in all the time, that there was this ego or this arrogance about Babylon, and we see that in Nebuchadnezzar, and then the transgression by wine. And so the downfall of Babylon is what the proverb for Babylon was about. And we noted Daniel chapter 5, of course, that's where Babylon ceases to exist as a great nation. And so we were then in the midst of the woes. And so through the first 3 woes, verse 6 through 8, the plunderer is going to be plundered. Of course, Babylon is the plunderer. They are going to be plundered themselves. It would be the Medo-Persian Empire that came in one night and would plunder them. 9 through 11, the greedy sins against his own soul. And we talked about the greed of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar in particular, and how he was heaping up judgment for himself in that. And then verse 12 through 14, the violent will fall before the Lord God. That's where we finished off. And in that portion, we had noted how there's actually some cross-reference between Habakkuk and some of the other prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, they use some of the same concepts and phrases in their writings as Habakkuk does here. But the end of it, verse 14, from where we ended up last time, was the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And so despite all that's going on, be assured that God is going to have victory, and that God's will is going to be done, and that God will give victory to those who do his will. All right, so picking up then at verse 15. So let's go ahead. We'll read 15 through 17. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor, pressing him to your bottle, even to make him drunk, that you may look on his nakedness. You are filled with shame instead of glory. You also drink and be exposed as uncircumcised. The cup of the Lord's right hand will be turned against you, and utter shame will be on your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will cover you, and the plunder of beasts which made them afraid, because of men's blood and the violence of the land and the city and all who dwell in it. All right, so woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor is the beginning portion of that. The imagery is that of taking advantage of somebody else. You get them drunk, you take advantage of them while they're intoxicated. David actually comes to mind because that's what he attempted to do with Uriah. When he called Uriah in from the battle, David had been with Bathsheba and he wanted to cover up his sin. And so I'll get him drunk and send him back to his house, and I'll be able to cover my sin up. Uriah was too honorable of a man, even as a drunk, to go and do what David had intended for him to do. But it's wicked to press someone to intoxication and then to manipulate them for our own benefit. And interesting that Babylon fell by intoxication, Daniel chapter 5, because the accusation against Babylon is that they used this among some of the people that they were defeating. And so, we focus a lot on the wars of Babylon, and they certainly engaged in a lot of wars, but it sounds like they had some diplomatic decisions made as well, and that they may have used wine in order to convince the others sitting at the table at times.
One thought that comes to mind is the king of Israel inviting the Chaldeans into his court and showing off all his wealth and everything like that. And the Chaldeans used that trust as a way to spy and say, "Oh, look at all the riches that he has that we can take."
Yeah, right? Yeah, very unwise.
Yeah.
Don't just open up your safe and let everybody see what's inside your safe. That's not a necessary thing. And then it all ended up going. He lost the entirety of it and more. So absolutely. So the prophet condemns this manipulation of others by intoxication. I would suggest that manipulation in and of itself is a problem, that whether by intoxication or not. But in verse 16, he says, you're going to expose yourself in all of this. And that is what happened, right? Because of their own intoxication, Babylon would be exposed through the time of Belshazzar. And so it came back on them. Now, verse 17, and we mentioned this last week briefly, latter part of 16, after be exposed as uncircumcised. We talked about that a little bit, maybe 2 weeks ago, I think. The Babylonians are uncircumcised. They are unclean. As lofty as they had thoughts of themselves, that they showed their true colors in that. But then the cup of the Lord's right hand will turn against you. This is the cup of God's judgment, or the cup of God's wrath against them. Verse 17, the violence done to Lebanon will cover you. Lebanon. What's Lebanon have to do with anything? Because the battle is between Judah and Babylon. Not Lebanon.
Well, Lebanon's brought up a lot in Scripture. They talk about the trees.
Yes,
Lebanon,
the cedars of Lebanon. Yeah.
So, taking a guess, I do picture Lebanon being kind of like a beautiful place, full of resources, right? And here, violence is being brought to it, and resources are seized.
Okay. Somewhat, yes. There are places in Scripture that will be speaking about Jerusalem and yet use Lebanon as the epitaph to speak about Jerusalem because of the cedars of Lebanon. And so when the kings of Jerusalem build their palaces, they go get the cedars of Lebanon, right? When anything big and beautiful in Jerusalem is built, the cedars of Lebanon are used in that. And so Isaiah does it, Jeremiah does it, Ezekiel does it, and Habakkuk does it, where it's actually a reference to Jerusalem itself. but there are so many cedars of Lebanon in Jerusalem that they use this idea of it being Lebanon. It's not literally Lebanon, but that it's as though all of the cedars of Lebanon have been transferred over to Jerusalem. That's sort of the idea. To the best of my knowledge, Nebuchadnezzar didn't actually go up against the forest of Lebanon and do anything with it. But he most certainly did come up against Jerusalem multiple times. And so they will come up and seek to destroy Lebanon, bring violence over Lebanon, Jerusalem, read Jerusalem. God is going to bring fear and violence and terror back to Babylon, just as they had brought to Jerusalem. Then we've got the fifth woe. At verse 18, what profit is the image that its maker should carve it? The molded image, a teacher of lies, that the maker of its mold should trust in it to make mute idols. Woe to him who says to wood, awake, to silent stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there is no breath at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple, that all the earth keeps silence before him. So woe to him who says to wood, awake. Because what's it going to do? Absolutely nothing, right? Wood's not going to wake up. It's rather foolish to do such a thing. It won't say anything because it is mute, and yet he describes it as a teacher of lies because people put their trust in it. And so, they've concocted the lies, but because they trust in it, then it becomes their teacher of lies. It reminds me somewhat of the battle at Mount Carmel between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And so remember, the prophet has this challenge to the prophets of Baal. You have a sacrifice, I have a sacrifice. We'll see whose God is going to answer and burn the sacrifice. And so he lets them go first, right? And not only does he let them go first, they have home field advantage. Because Mount Carmel is a high place, not just a high place in that particular region. It is the high place. And so it is where they would go to worship Baal. So, that's pretty convenient for them. Baal ought to be able to answer at a place that he supposedly meets with them all the time. And so they call out to Baal, and what does Baal do? He's sleeping. Yeah. And that's what Elijah says, your God must be sleeping or something. Yell louder, okay? See if you can wake him up. And they keep on yelling louder, and they're dancing, and they end up cutting themselves. They're doing all kinds of things to try and get Baal's attention. Maybe he was on vacation, not just sleeping. He might have been away. But he didn't answer. And so then about the time when the evening sacrifice is to be given, and so the timing is sort of interesting, that's when Elijah begins to prepare. And as Elijah is preparing, he wants them to build a moat around his altar, and then douse the altar and the sacrifice with water, and fill the moat with water. And then maybe we'll douse the sacrifice and the altar with water again. And then maybe we'll do that again, right? Keep in mind, there's a famine, a drought going on, right? There is a lack of water. And so, he's likely upsetting some people by doing all this. But then he calls out to God, and God answers. There is fire that comes down from heaven, consumes the sacrifice, consumes the altar, dries up all the water. And so the people know that the Lord God in Israel is certainly alive. Well, these folks, the Babylonians, they're calling out to their gods, arise and speak and awake, and their gods won't do anything. So they have gods that are useless. Verse 20, however. And so, again, this is the one who's going to do the judging is in verse 20, right? That's the key to this. They've got their gods can't do anything for them. And so the one who brings about all of these woes is spoken of in verse 20. The Lord is in his holy temple. The contrast here is the idols, they have no answers, no teachings, no life. The Lord is in his holy temple. Not just that he's confined in some kind of temple. That's not it at all. And the temple there, I'm not so sure of the temple that is being mentioned here is necessarily talking about the Jerusalem temple. I get it that is the dwelling place of God among his people, but is that the dwelling place of God? No. He's in heaven, right? So those idols, where are those idols? Right, they're here on earth. And other than the physical representation, they don't actually exist. And so call out to them all you want to. You know, how silly to talk to wood. I've got a wood podium right here. It'd be foolish for me to start talking to this thing and expecting it to do anything. It won't, right? It's just a piece of wood. When you and I call out to the Lord God, we are calling out to the creator of heaven and earth. And when he says that the Lord is in his holy temple, yes, for Israel, that meant, okay, he's there in Jerusalem at the temple. His presence is there. But greater than that, he is the God of heaven and earth. And he dwells in heaven above. And so the Lord is alive is the point of it. He is a living God as opposed to all these dead gods. The Lord is in his holy temple. Psalm 11 and verse 4, it says, the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids test the sons of men. Habakkuk didn't even mention the eyes of these idols. I think both Jeremiah and Isaiah do. They've got eyes, but they can't see. They've got hands, but they can't do anything. They've got legs, but they can't walk. You know, they've got all kinds of features, and yet none of the features actually do anything. The Lord God, he sees, he hears, he does. And so even when Babylon destroyed the physical temple, which was at Jerusalem, the Lord was still in his holy temple. He wasn't in the temple at Jerusalem. It had been destroyed. It was being taken apart and torn down. But he was still in his temple. He was still in heaven, and he was still in charge. He was still ruling, and his will is actually what was being affected. The latter portion of verse 20, let all the earth keep silence before him. The idea there is not zip it. That's not his meaning when he says this. The idea is submission before God. So don't go bow down before these useless idols that were made with men's hands and give them glory and honor, because they can't do anything. They don't even know that you're trying to glorify them. But rather submit ourselves to God in heaven, be subject to his will, because God is preeminent. He is over all. He is the one true God. And so Psalm 76 and verse 8, it says, you caused the judgments to be heard from heaven. The earth feared and was still. When the earth hears the message of God, they need to pause and stop and take note of that and then go and obey it. That's part of why Judah is being decimated, is because they didn't do that. They stopped serving God. And they started turning to the idols that the Babylonians and others were serving. All right, so that closes out chapter 2. What's in there for us? Well, first of all, we might not understand why God is doing what he's doing or how it's going to work out and all that kind of stuff. And that's okay. We don't necessarily need to understand. What we need to do is we need to have confidence that God knows how to work things out. And so I might be in a really bad position and I don't see a way out. I need to keep on trusting God. God is going to find the way. God knows how things are going to work out. And Romans 8:28, he works all things for good to those who love the Lord, those who are the called according to his purpose. Now, in that text, it's a text that does get misused. Understand, he's not talking about our physical condition, right? Sometimes our physical condition is going to get in a really bad way, right? The people of Judah, even the righteous of Judah, they're being carried away captive. That wasn't a good thing for them. It was better than the alternative. The alternative was death. But when Romans 8:28, when Paul's talking about God working things out for our good, he's talking about our spiritual benefit. That's God's true concern, is our spiritual benefit. See, because we live here for a short time. I know it seems like a long time sometimes, but it's a short time when you compare it to eternity. And so God is preparing us for eternity. God is still in his holy temple. Interesting that as this is revealed to Habakkuk, the temple on earth is about to be destroyed, right? And so, but God, what are you going to do when they destroy your temple? He's still in his temple, right? God is still ruling. And that's the key to this. God has not stopped to rule. Oh, but the world is so wicked today, right? Yeah, it is. Absolutely. Rule in the midst of your enemies. That's what he's doing. And so the Lord is still ruling. He's still in control. And, the ebb and flow of wickedness, that's been going on since the beginning. And it will go on until the end. And that's okay. Because if you look throughout the ages, God always is victorious, right? No matter what circumstance we're looking at, God and those who are with him find victory. And so we can take comfort in that God is greater than any enemies that we're going to face. God is always going to bear us through, give us victory. And so we need to be those who are going to trust in God. All right, anything else on chapter 2? Chapter 3. So, we haven't spoken about Habakkuk's name yet, have we? This would be a good time to speak about Habakkuk's name. So Habakkuk's name means he that embraces or a wrestler. He that embraces or a wrestler. Well, what's Habakkuk been doing with God for the past 2 chapters? He's been wrestling, right? God, you need to do something about this. God tells him what he's going to do. God, don't do that. That's not the solution. And so he's been wrestling with God in the text. But now the other part of his name, the idea of embracing, and this is grappling that's being focused upon here, right? But he's going to embrace and accept what God has to say. And so that is what we're going to see now in this chapter is Habakkuk is on board with God's plan. It doesn't matter if Habakkuk is on board with God's plan or not, right? God's plan is still God's plan. But Habakkuk is now on board with the plan of God. All right, so in chapter 3, let's go ahead. We'll do a little bit of reading here. Chapter 3 and verse 1. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. He had rays flashing from his hands, and there his power was hidden. Before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian trembled. O Lord, you were displeased with the river. Were you displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea that you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. Selah. You divided the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrow they went, at the shining of your glittering spear. You marched through the land in indignation. You trampled the nations in anger. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. You struck the head from the house of the wicked by laying bare from the foundation to neck. Selah. You thrust through with his own arrows the head of his villages. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like feasting on the poor in secret. You walked through the sea with your horses through the heap of great waters. When I heard, my body trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones. And I trembled in myself that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high hills. To the chief musician with my stringed instruments. All right. So it starts out in verse 1 being identified as a prayer. And then do you see the word Selah appearing there 3 times in the text? It's song. That's instruction to the song leader. And so it's not just a prayer, it's a prayer that was turned into a psalm. And so that we have the Psalm of Habakkuk here. All right, so Habakkuk gives us this prayer, and we've got this word in verse 1, Shigionoth. What is Shigionoth?
No idea.
No idea. Okay. I had no idea either, right? And so went looking, the same word is in Psalm 7 and verse 1. It's the word meditation in Psalm 7 and verse 1, a meditation of David, which he sang to the Lord concerning the words of Cush, a Benjamite. So, yeah. Now, that's not the only way that it's translated. Some translations, I believe it's the King James, says Shigion of David. Strong's defines the word as an aberration, a dithyramb, or a rambling poem. This is his rambling poem. So that's sort of his characterization of a psalm, I suppose. In the Vulgate, it actually reads for ignorances or for sins committed in ignorance. And so there's a bunch of different ideas. The simple part of it is a meditation, a rambling poem. It is his song concerning the things that are about to happen. So the Lord's response is what causes this. And what he does in our text here is his meditation, his rambling thoughts, goes back to bygone years. Now, some of what we read there was a little bit difficult to grasp. What is he talking about, right? He has gone back in the text here to think about a previous time when God's people were captive. When would that have been?
The time of the Judges.
Even before that.
Oh, Egypt.
Yeah, he goes back to Egypt. That is what the bulk of this is about. Mm-hmm. It is basically about God releasing his people from Egypt, taking them through the wilderness and bringing them into the land of Canaan. And so now we'll talk about that as we make our way through, but it makes sense that that's where his mind goes to, because God has just told him, yeah, Jerusalem's going to fall, Judah's going to be destroyed, your people are going to be taken captive, Babylon's doing that. Now, last time we were captive, God released us. God set us free. And now how much of that does Habakkuk understand? I don't know. But Jeremiah is going to come along and he's going to say it very outright. Go, because God's bringing your descendants back. And so God will release you. Yeah, go ahead.
One thing. When God's watching you, how does he watch everybody else at the same time?
Because he can be everywhere at the same time.
Like, I don't understand. Like, he doesn't.
Exactly. Yeah, it's hard to understand, right? Because if you're looking in one direction, you can only see whatever's in front of you, right? But God's not that way. You and I are limited. We are humans, which limits us. We are finite beings, which means that we have limitations. God doesn't have limitations. He's not human, right? He is divine. He's deity. He is God. And our understanding of the nature of God, we can talk about a lot of it, but we don't, to fully understand how does that work? A lot of it we have to just accept by faith. The Bible tells us what he's able to do, and then we believe that what God says he can do because he shows us over and over that he's able to. Now, here's the thing. You don't have to understand how something works to know that it works. So when you and your dad get out in the car to go back home, do you know how the engine on a car works? You do? You know about combustion engines and... Okay. You can learn about that, right? We can increase our knowledge of something like that, but I'm guessing you don't know how a combustion engine works. But it still works even though you don't know how, right? And there's more complex things we could talk about that, we don't know how those things work either, and yet they do. And so we don't know how God works. We know what God does. The process, that's on God's end. He's got better knowledge than we do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Mariana, you had a question?
So, if you pray and you pray to him, and what if another person prays at the same time as you? How does he answer both of the prayers?
Because he can do what we cannot. So if you try to listen to three people talking to you at the same time, you're going to have to choose one, right? You can't listen to three people at once. You won't know what they all said. God can know what 8 billion people are saying at the same time. If everybody on earth were to pray to God at the exact same time, he would be able to hear and understand and answer all of them. Yeah, again, no limits. So, all right, Linda, and then we're going to get back into Habakkuk.
Wouldn't it be a less talking something like a lot of people are talking at the same time?
That's what it would be to you and I. We wouldn't be able to understand it, right? You ever been in a big crowd and everybody's talking, and it's hard to understand anything that's going on, right? But again, that's the difference between us and God. God doesn't have our limitations. We've only got 2 ears and they work together to hear one thing. We can't hear multiple things at the same time and make sense of it. Is Earth a tiny dot? Well, before God it is. So, all right, let's get back into Habakkuk. So he is talking about Egypt and coming out of Egypt. And so in verse 2, O Lord, I have heard your speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So this is his introduction into it. And so remember, he said back in 2 and verse 1, I'm going to stand here. I'm going to wait. I'm going to watch. I'm going to be corrected by God because I know I'm wrong. And so now he acknowledges, Lord, I have heard you. I've been corrected. You're right. I'm wrong. Still don't like it a whole lot, but you're right. I'm wrong. Your plan is like you. It is great. Still don't like it, but it's great. And so I was afraid of what I had heard, but Lord, do your work. Revive your work in the midst of the years. Lord, nobody can work like you can. Nobody can accomplish the things that you accomplish. And so now what is the work of God, though? Because he says, revive your work. Well, it's interesting that Isaiah 45, verse 11, identifies Israel as the work of God's hands. And so they're about to die, right? He's about to bring destruction upon his people. And so Habakkuk's prayer is, bring them back. revive them, resurrect them, bring them back, restore your people. Psalm 64 and verse 9, the work of God there is used to describe God's judgment against his enemies. And so what did God just say in chapter 2? I'm going to judge Babylon too. And so put those two thoughts together, that God's work is him providing for and caring for his people and judging his enemies. And so Habakkuk's on board with this plan. We're useless the way we are. Habakkuk acknowledged that back in the first 4 verses of chapter 1. There is no justice in Judah. People are treating one another awful. There's violence in Judah. Yeah, we need to be cleansed. We need a change. And Babylon is that change. But in the midst of all that, he asked God to remember his mercy. And so not complete destruction. Don't destroy the people as the people up north, as Israel. Israel was completely destroyed, not brought back. But God is going to give mercy in the midst of his wrath. And he does, because he's going to bring Judah back. Would he be just to just completely wipe them off the map? He would, because they were that wicked. But God also keeps his word, and he's got a promise he still needs to fulfill through Judah, because there's a Messiah who hasn't come yet, and that Messiah is going to come through Judah. And therefore, that's why Israel in the north, Assyria came in, destroyed them. There was nothing left, nothing to be restored. Judah in the south, we're going to give them a 70-year timeout, and then we'll bring them back and hit the reset button and see if things can be a little bit better. So he pleads with God for God to exercise his mercy in the midst of his judgment. And there is just a host of verses in the Bible that link those two ideas together, that God is going to judge, but that God is also merciful, and he doesn't want to destroy any. All right, so verse 3 and 4, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. So obviously God didn't come literally from Teman. That's not the dwelling place of God, right? But when he says that God came from Teman, he's coming from the east is the idea. And so here's a map. There's Teman right there. It's a region that is in the southern part of Edom. It's southeast of where Israel would be. Incidentally, we know somebody from Teman, or at least Job did. One of Job's friends, Eliphaz, was a Temanite. And so this is where he's from. But not far from Teman, to the southwest of it, is Mount Paran. Mount Paran is Sinai. So God is pictured here as coming from Teman, coming from the east. The brightness of the sun, I think, is sort of what's being conveyed here, is the glory of God. God comes and he goes over to Egypt, and he's going to bring his people and bring them back to Paran and give them a law. Incidentally, that Sinai and Paran are one and the same. Deuteronomy 33 verse 2, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of his saints. From his right hand came a fiery law for them. So Sinai, Mount Seir, Mount Paran, all the same, all reference to that same region. So Habakkuk's thoughts went to Sinai, where God gave his law, because when God appeared at Sinai, his glory covered the heavens and the earth was full of his praise. What a blessed time in Israel's history. Because, yes, we want to follow God's law. We're here in front of God. God is awesome. And, he's got that mountain covered with the cloud, and this is terrifying. But wow, we are no longer slaves in Egypt. And God is there and giving us a law. Exodus 19 and verse 18, it says, Mount Sinai was completely covered in smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. There was thundering and lightning, and the lightning lit up the world. Psalm 77 verse 18 talks about. And so we've got the brightness his brightness like a light, his hand, he had rays flashing from his hands, the lightning that's being there, his power is there, but covered over, if you will, by the smoke and the cloud. And so that's where his mind goes to, is the great, powerful display that was there. Now, just prior to that, however, they were captives. And so keep coming down in the text, verse 5 through 7. 5, before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. Anybody got a different translation other than New King James? Okay. 5.
Before him went the pestilence, and burning coals went forth at his feet.
Okay, burning coals. There's a few different ways that's rendered. Young's literal translation would agree with King James that it's burning coals or a burning flame. Most translations carry the idea of pestilence and plague. Pestilence and plague, or plague and pestilence. That's pretty common. NIV, RSV, ESV, New American Standard, Web, several others. ISV says disease. But he's focused on Egypt, because before we were able as a people to come out to God at Mount Sinai, we were captive. We were enslaved. And then God freed us. And how did God free us? Well, before him went pestilence. Pestilence and plague. Well, what do we call those 10 things that happened on Egypt? They're the 10 plagues, right? In the midst of them, in fact, right in the middle of them, were 3 plagues of pestilence. Plagues 4, 5, and 6 were all plagues of pestilence. And so there was the flies in 4, which would carry disease among the people and among the livestock. Then the 5th one is specifically pestilence among the livestock. And then the 6th one, festering boils on man and beast, which again just makes it right for everybody to get ill and die. And so there was pestilence, there was plagues, and I think plagues is certainly better than the fever of the New King James here. The King James with the idea of a burning flame, destruction, I suppose, would be in that idea. But it's all associated with the plagues of Egypt. In verse 6, he stood and measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations. And so what he does is he scatters the mountains and bows the hills down. Now, he's not talking about literal mountains and hills. When prophets talk about mountains and hills, what are they talking about? Nations. These are the nations. And so the greatest nation on earth during the time when the people of God were enslaved was who? It was Egypt. They were the world power at that time. And so God comes in, and it's a simple request, right? Let my people go. And Pharaoh says no. And so Moses says, well, God has a 10-part lesson for you about who he is, since you don't know. And so there's 10 plagues that are brought on Egypt, and Egypt is no longer great. And they have never been a great, powerful nation since. They've never been a world power since that time. And so God brought low the greatest nation on earth, but he brought low every nation, because he goes through with his people, and he is going to defeat whomever he comes up against. And this starts not just, it starts with the people coming out of Egypt, but then it goes all the way through to when they finally come into the land. And so God is bringing nation after nation down before his people. And so herein is the hope. If he smote Egypt and released his people from Egyptian captivity, then what will he do to Babylon? Since he has just said he's going to destroy Babylon. He's going to free his people. And so Habakkuk can cling to that hope. Verse 7, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian trembled. So Cushan, some associate Cushan with the king of Mesopotamia in Judges chapter 3. His name was Cush. and Othniel is the judge who was against him. It says that the children of Israel served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. It's doubtful that Habakkuk is referring to this Mesopotamian king. I don't think that that's the case. It doesn't fit with the context of the Israelites and their exodus from Egypt and their being brought into the land. So Cushan, now I do agree with those who say, no, it's Cush rather than Cushan. It is Cush. From my understanding, the suffix "an" is added in here for poetic reasons, to rhyme it with Midian. And so it's just added in on the end of it in order to make it rhyme. It is a reference to Cush. Do I have it here? There. Okay. There's the land of Cush. Cush is this region which is northern Ethiopia, southern area of Egypt, according to Easton Bible Dictionary. And then he adds to that not only Cushan and their tents being afflicted, but the curtains of the land of Midian were trembling. There's Midian on the other side too. On their way out, guess who they're meeting, right? These are the kinds of people that they're going to be meeting on their way out. And they're not going to stand against God's people. And so, the Midianites, they were a nomadic people. You're going to find them all over the place. But this is the area next to the Red Sea where they originated from. And so when God's people encountered them on their exit from Egypt, he exalted his people and blessed them on their way, and no one was going to stop him from bringing his people out. Again, the nations and the mountains, the hills are being brought low. So verse 8 through 11, he talks about water. There's a lot of water in this chapter. But were you displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea? So rivers and sea. Now, it's a series of rhetorical questions. The answer is no. God wasn't upset with the water. But what rivers and what seas, one sea, is he talking about?
Nile.
Yeah, the Nile's the start one, right? Turned it to blood.
And the Red Sea, which he parted.
All right. So we've got the Nile River. God turned that to blood, displaying his power. And then on their exit, he parted the Red Sea. And then unparted it. And in unparting it, he destroyed Pharaoh's army. And so those that were pursuing are now destroyed. And then eventually there is another river. The Jordan. Took a long time to get there, right? Shouldn't have, but it took them 40 years to finally get to the Jordan River. And so God's working with the water. He's turning one of them to blood. He's parting the other two, doing all kinds of work with water here. And it's not a display of his anger or anything of that nature. It's that they are subject to his command, and he's using them in order to free his people and bring them to the promised land. Do you see why Habakkuk finds hope in this? Right? Because if God has done this for us in the past, as wicked as we are, and he's going to take us away, and we're going to be in captivity again. But the last time we were in captivity as a people, God brought us out and gave us a promised land. And so Habakkuk is clinging to that hope. So poetically, as he speaks about the Lord giving victory, he uses this idea of chariots of salvation, that God is riding in these chariots of salvation. Of course, God doesn't need salvation. The chariots of salvation are for his people. And so he bore his people from being destitute and being slaves to now being a people who have a land flowing with milk and honey. They have a homeland to call their own. They have victory over the people of that land. And God would do this again for his people, eventually leading them away from Babylon. Therein is the hope that Habakkuk has. Verse 9. In verse 9, your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. So his bow and these arrows and so forth. Now, the King James reads, "Thy bow was made quite naked." It means ready. "According to the oaths of the tribes, even thy word." So God's ready to fight for his people as he leads them to Canaan. His bow is ready, but then the oaths of the tribes, and the New King James doesn't include that portion about the tribes. Its oaths were sworn. Well, sworn by who? King James says by the tribes. Well, remember when they come up on the east side of the Jordan, and we've got a couple of tribes that, hey, this looks like a pretty good land. We'd like to stay here. They then had to swear an oath to the rest of the nation that they were going to go and help them defeat the land, conquer it, subdue it, and then they would go back home. And God expected them to give the oath and to keep their oath. And I believe it's Numbers 23 and verse 32, where if they did not keep their oath, God made the statement, this is a paraphrase. Say again? Be sure your sin will find you out. Yeah, do not keep your word and your sin's going to find you out. And so they were bound to their oath to their brethren so that all of Israel would go in and see the land and find victory. And so God is, again, he's leading his people to the promised land. Now, verse 10, "The mountain saw you and trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered its voice and lifted its hands on high." Some commentators state that verse 10 is about the flood. I'm not sure exactly how they get that. It seems out of context, right?
Where is it?
Verse 10.
Oh, the deep uttered its voice?
Yeah, and lifted his hands on high. You know, it's like, oh, that's about the flood. I don't think he just switched topics and went back to the flood. There's no hope for Judah in the flood story. This is about the Exodus and about the conquest of Canaan. And I believe that it's the same context as we go in here. And so the mountains, again, reference to nations. Nation after nation were falling before God's people. The overflowing of the waters, the voice of the deep, perhaps in reference to what happened with the Red Sea when it finally did collapse back in. The greatest nation on earth is no longer the greatest nation because their army is now at the bottom of the Red Sea, dead. And so God has given victory to his people. Verse 11 happens in the book of Joshua, I believe. "So the sun and moon stood still in their habitation. At the light of your arrows, they went at the shining of your glittering spear." So Joshua 10 and verse 12. Remember the day when the sun stood still and the moon stood still on that day until Israel had victory over their enemies. And so, again, the focus over and over is God is giving us victory over enemy after enemy, over nation after nation. And Habakkuk sees that God's going to do this again. And so, that's why he's on board with what God has to say. 12 through 15. "You marched through the land in indignation. You trampled the nations in anger. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed." Do you see how much salvation has been talked about in chapter 3? That's the focus here, is God saving his people.
I just noticed it's 8 right now.
It is. Yeah. We're not going to finish this out tonight then. So next week we will pick up at verse 12. And I suspect there's likely enough between 12 and 19 for us to spend next Wednesday evening in that. So, all right. Any questions, comments on what we've looked at so far? Yep.
Just a comment. I think it's awesome, applying a lot of this to today too, because God is the same as he was.
Yes.
Even as he is now, where he keeps his promises and the whole idea of if God is for you, who can be against you, right?
Absolutely.
Sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's like, wow, that's the same God that we serve.
Yes. Yeah. And we've got God's people in just awful situations. That's okay, because God can work with awful situations and bring about glory.
Yeah, he was
So,
right,
Yeah, absolutely. And so if we're in a bad place, bring your petitions before the Lord. Yeah, for he cares for you. Don't be anxious, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. He'll give you peace. Now, and we're going to see that towards the end. He is at peace with this. That doesn't mean that he likes it, but he's at peace with it. All right, Linda, then Grayson, and then we need to close with a song.
It's just really confusing how he can do so many things that we can't.
Yeah. All right. Can you do anything that an ant can't do?
I can't go in tiny dirt houses.
What?
I can't go in tiny dirt houses.
Okay, well, ants can do some things that you can't. I get that.
And,
But you're a lot bigger than an ant, right?
yeah,
And you can do things that ants can't do,
yeah.
right? And so we're a larger and bigger and greater creature than they are. And God is infinitely greater than we are. So, yeah. All right, Grayson?
I forgot what slavery means.
What's that?
I forgot what slavery means.
You forgot what slavery means?
Yeah.
So they were serving other people, and that was their life.
Forcibly.
Yeah, they were forced to serve other people.
Like white people and then black people, they force you to do something. So at baby feeders, the black people have to set the stage and the upper stage, and then all the people just sit down on chairs.
Yeah, so that's a form of slavery that happened in North America,
And
and it happened to be white and black. The same thing has happened in other places of the world with different groups of people as well. So there's been slavery all over the world.
they would call them
We don't know you.
yeah,
I think you remember
Yeah.
what slavery is.
But these days you would call in jail.
Yeah.
Could you?
No, but we're not going to say that, right? It's bad. It's
Right. Yeah, so there have been some times in history where slavery has been based upon your ethnicity, what country you came from, what your skin color is, that kind of thing. There's other times where slavery has been based upon whether you're poor or not. The very, very poor would end up having to sell themselves as a slave because otherwise they're going to die because they can't afford to feed themselves. And then other times it was just simply a army would come in and they would defeat you, and well, you're either going to die or you're going to become a slave. And maybe being the slave wasn't as bad as dying. And so a number of ways that would happen.
technical term for that for the poor people is indentured servitude,
Yes.
which is a distinction without a difference if you're on the receiving end.
Right. And that one is actually found in the Bible, except that God has rules for the one who is the slave owner. Mm-hmm. And especially if that slave is a Jewish person, you set them free at the end of 7 years, and you set them up for success when they go out. So, yeah. All right. Turn our time back over to Jeremy.